Chapter 4 John Webster, The Duchess of Malfi, Tragic Conflict. Aims. This chapter will examine the treatment of the themes of love and death in Acts 3 to 5 of The Duchess of Malfi, provide you with further practice in textual analysis, discuss some of the theatrical devices and techniques Webster employs in the play, consider the play as a performance text. Introduction. The conflict set up in Acts 1 and 2 intensifies in Acts 3 to 5 as the play's tragic conventions take center stage. Not surprisingly, then, we will focus in this chapter more on the representation of death than love. We will look first at the mounting danger facing the Duchess and her family in Act 3, and then go on to examine how the tragic crisis of Act 4 is staged. We will also consider the dramatic function of Act 5, viewed by many as the least successful part of the play. Throughout this chapter, we will continue to analyze the language of the text, while also attending to Webster's stagecraft and the performance possibilities of particular episodes. Act 3 Reversal of Fortune. The discussion between Antonio and Delio that opens Act 3 Scene 1 alerts us to the fact that a considerable amount of time has elapsed since Ferdinand's vow of revenge, enough time for the Duchess to give birth to two more children, a son and a daughter. So in part, the function of this scene is to inform us of the passage of time. The scene also lets us know that Ferdinand has returned to the Duchess's court. When the Duchess and Antonio exit, leaving Ferdinand and Bezzola alone on stage, Ferdinand immediately reveals his real state of mind. Her guilt treads on, hot burning coulters, along with his determination to force confession from her. He then asks Bezzola for a key to the Duchess's bedchamber. Act 3, Scene 2, The Turning Point. Act 3, Scene 1 clearly colors our response to the next scene, which is set in the Duchess's bedchamber, and in which we watch with the strong suspicion that Ferdinand is waiting in the wings. This works to create an almost unbearable level of suspense. The film director Alfred Hitchcock, a master of suspense, was once asked in an interview how he went about stimulating suspense in an audience. He gave the following reply, and I quote, "Let us suppose that there is a bomb underneath this table between us. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, boom, there is an explosion. The public is surprised, but prior to this surprise, it has seen as an absolutely ordinary scene of no special consequence. Now let us take a suspense situation. The bomb is underneath the table, and the public knows it. The public is aware that the bomb is going to explode at 1 o'clock, and there is a clock in the decor. The public can see that it is 1:15. The audience is longing to warn the characters. In the first case, we have given the public 15 seconds of surprise at the moment of the explosion. In the second case, we have provided them with 15 minutes of suspense." Hitchcock was talking here about film rather than drama, but the principle is the same. Webster generates suspense in his readers and spectators by making them aware of the presence of a threat of which the characters on stage are oblivious. So in Act 3, Scene 2, we are shown that rarity in early modern tragedy, a happy and loving marriage. This is all the more remarkable given the numerous pressures it has had to endure, the discrepancy in rank and authority between wife and husband, the years of enforced secrecy accompanied by the constant risk of discovery, the fact that the couple have now had 3 children together and thus are far from being in the first throes of passion. Antonio and the Duchess are getting ready for bed, teasing one another and joking, looking forward to sleeping together. Their mutual affection is expressed not in sentimental platitudes of true love, but in an erotic playfulness, and that is all the more affecting because we know or suspect that this moment of domestic happiness is about to be shattered. As in the courtship episode of Act 1, Webster is happy to acknowledge sexual desire as an integral ingredient in a successful marriage. Yet, here too his language intensifies our sense of the fragility of the mutual love and attraction being enacted, as Frank Whihams explains, and I quote, "Antonio says he rises early after a night with his wife because he is glad his wearisome night's work is over. The affectionate inversion displaces the real reason for early rising. The oppressive need for secrecy, typical of adultery rather than of marriage. Lightheartedness is simultaneously present and painfully absent. It is when Antonio and Cariola decide to play an affectionate joke on the Duchess that she is left alone in her bedchamber and Ferdinand enters. In the theater, then the scene would provide visual signals of her isolation and vulnerability. There is, moreover, a telling substitution for Ferdinand, as for a moment the Duchess chatters on and he stands in her husband's place. This is a major turning point in the play, the moment when a tragic outcome seems inevitable. The dramatic change of tone is signaled visually, by the stage business, but also linguistically, by a change in the language. The easy, informal banter of the first section of the scene gives way to a very different brand of speech as Ferdinand dominates the proceedings, speaking the majority of lines and twice ordering his sister to be silent. While not quite as frenzied as in Act 2, Scene 5, Ferdinand's language still manages to suggest the depth of the character's anger and agitation. It abounds in rhetorical questions such as virtue, where art thou hid? And this hectoring, self-righteous tone alternates with more overtly violent reproaches. Die then, quickly! And then the howling of a wolf is music to thee, screech owl. The last quotation shows his habitual fondness for likening human beings to the most negative aspects of the animal world. He addresses his longest speech to Antonio, though he declines the Duchess's invitation to meet her new husband, on the grounds that it would provoke such violent effects, as would damn us both. Although his angry and long-winded preaching at his sister is alienating, his language does point to a genuine moral anxiety about his own conduct. As before in Act 2, Scene 5, Webster seems intent on endowing his principal villain with moral and psychological complexity. In the end, Ferdinand leaves the stage still ignorant of the identity of the Duchess's new husband, though he assures her that she is undone or ruined, and twice that he will never see her again. Activity 1. Let's consider now how this crucial moment in the play, Ferdinand's appearance in the Duchess's bedchamber, might look on stage. In doing this, we need to think about any clues the play text gives us about performance possibilities. Reread Act 3, Scene 2 from the start up to the point where Ferdinand first speaks, line 70. Try to answer these questions. What is the Duchess doing when Ferdinand enters? What does Ferdinand do when he appears in the bedchamber? How does the Duchess react to her brother? Discussion. Here are my answers to the questions. 1. At the start of the scene, the Duchess requests a mirror and a jewelry box, and later makes several comments on her hair. My hair tangles, and doth not the color of my hair begin to change? These are textual clues which suggest that in performance, the actress playing the Duchess would be sitting in front of a mirror, brushing her hair, still chatting to her now absent husband when Ferdinand silently enters. Her half-line, "Have you lost your tongue?" is a cue to her either to turn around and discover her brother standing behind her, or to see his reflection in the mirror. 2. The stage direction tells us that Ferdinand gives her a poniard or dagger, perhaps the same one he appeared to threaten her with in Act 1, Scene 1. Stage directions are obviously one of the principal ways in which dramatists indicate how the text of the play should be performed. But in early modern drama, they are often few and far between and lacking in detail, leaving directors with many performance-related decisions to make. 3. Here are the first lines the Duchess speak after discovering her brother's presence, and I quote, "'Tis welcome, for now whether I am doomed to live or die, I can do both like a prince." The first, very short line requires there to be a pause before the next one begins if the meter is to be sustained. In performance, this may indicate the Duchess's shocked silence or her reaching out and taking of the dagger. If the former, her recovery is swift as she adopts again the heroic idiom we heard at the end of Act 1, when she was venturing into the wilderness of her clandestine marriage. What strikes me most about the Duchess's reaction to her brother's very threatening appearance is her astonishing self-possession. The actress playing the Duchess would need to convey this through her voice and posture. The text also provides us with information about the set and the costumes in this scene. The fact that it takes place in the Duchess's bedchamber means that in most productions there is a bed on stage, which often adds to the scene's sexual charge. The Duchess is usually wearing a nightgown, which can increase the sense of her vulnerability here. The Duchess's language in this part of the play contrasts sharply with her brother's. She meets Ferdinand's anger with clear, straightforward statements and questions. I pray, sir, hear me. I am married. And will you see my husband? She also objects to his tone of moral outrage. Why might not I marry? I have not gone about in this to create any new world or costume. On one level, this seems disingenuous as her earlier speeches in Act 1. Scene 1 make clear she knows full well how radical and unprecedented her second marriage is. Yet on another level, her simplicity of expression captures the irrationality of the brother's prohibition and so invites our sympathy. To marry a second time is indeed not to create any new world. The Duchess's conduct in this scene also contrasts with that of her husband, who remains offstage throughout her ordeal and re-enters, carrying a pistol and making threats. Only once Ferdinand is safely out of the way. The Duchess, by contrast, has already come up with a plan for dealing with the situation, which she immediately puts into action when Bazzola turns up on the scene a few lines later. This final section of Act 3, Scene 2, involving Antonio's flight to Ancona, under cover of the Duchess's trumped-up charge of embezzlement, opens a space for further satire on the royal court and explicit consideration of the debate about the relative claims of birth and merit. As Bazzola, with his usual linguistic creativity, presents an extended defense of the now disgraced Antonio. This brings us to the difficult question of whether Bazzola means what he says here. At the end of the scene, he is left alone on stage to deliver a soliloquy in which he discloses to the audience that he is going to tell Ferdinand everything he has just learned. Moreover, when he enters the close of Act 3, Scene 5 to arrest the Duchess, he contradicts everything he has said here on the merit versus birth debate. His inconsistency provides us with a good example of just how ambiguous early modern play texts can be. We have in these two chapters on the Duchess of Malfi repeatedly attempted to interpret the text of the play, considering, for example, whether the Duchess is represented critically or sympathetically, or how we should read Ferdinand's extreme reaction to the birth of his sister's first child. Bazzola's conduct in Act 3 is a particularly glaring instance of a moment when a play text appears to be crying out for its audience to engage in the act of interpretation. There is no single right answer to the question of whether or not Bazzola is sincere in his defense of Antonio, and each reader and spectator will need to decide whether he or she stands on this question. A director of the play would have to come to the similar decision. This does not mean that every reading or staging is as good as every other. Any interpretation that can explain itself by reference to the text of the play, the actual words on the page, will obviously be more convincing than the one that cannot. Activity 2. Pretend that you are directing a production of The Duchess of Malfi. How would you instruct the actor playing Bazzola to play Act 3, Scene 2? How would you justify your reading of his character? Remember that you need to anchor your interpretation in the text of the play. Discussion. This is how I would direct the actor playing Bazzola. And remember, this is only one possible response. I would stress the importance of trying to convey to the audience the essential ambiguity of Bazzola's character. From the start, Webster has told us that his malcontent character despises courtly corruption at the same time that he is hopelessly inflicted on it. He wants social advancement, but loathes the servility that is the only way to rise in the world of the court. There is little reason to believe that Bazzola admires Antonio as much as he says he does in his speeches to the Duchess. The play has made it clear there is little love lost between these two characters. But he has watched as a courtly official, low-born like himself, has been dismissed from his office, apparently on the whim of the Duchess, and castigated by other officers who yesterday fawned on him. It would be strange if Bazzola did not feel a certain amount of indignation at these events. I would further justify this way of playing the role of Bazzola by reference to his speeches in this part of the play, which are full of the self-loathing that characterizes him throughout, especially in relation to his role as Ferdinand's intelligencer. When Bazzola wants to describe the kind of degrading toadying for favor in which court officers engage, he imagines their being willing even to make their eldest sons court spies. In his soliloquy, he characterizes the politician or political schemer as the devil's quilted anvil, a metaphor which figures the devil as a demonic blacksmith silently bringing sin into the world, courtesy of the politician's cunning and dissimulation. The ingenuity of the metaphor is typical of Bozzola's linguistic flamboyance, and it bespeaks a certain amount of self-congratulation. But Bozzola is no Iago, revealing in his own destructive powers. To describe oneself as the devil's servant is less than entirely flattering, and the self-criticism surfaces, albeit freely, in the exclamation, "Oh, this base quality of intelligencer!" A pang of conscience when he brushes aside by telling himself that a spy, like any other professional person, naturally desires to be rewarded and praised for a job well done. The concluding couplet drives the point home. Bozzola wants preferment, and he will, for the time being at least, remain the servant of forces he knows are wicked. But Webster stresses the inner division that makes his court satirist so ambiguous and complex a figure. So how would an actor convey this kind of ambivalence to the audience? It would be a good deal easier on film, where the close-up would provide ample opportunities for a good character to show through facial expressions the kind of rapid fluctuation in mood from self-disgust to self-congratulation and back again. That is signaled by the language of the soliloquy. On a stage, an actor would be more reliant on tone and pace of delivery, using his voice to convey these mood changes, with gestures and body movements contributing to the overall effect, helping to communicate to the audience the combination of self-criticism and self-satisfaction which the language of the speech suggests. Act 3, Scene 4, The Dumb Show. In Act 3, Scene 4, Ferdinand and the Cardinal learn from Bozzola the identity of their sister's husband, and that her family is seeking sanctuary in the state of Ancona. The Cardinal, about to resume his profession as a soldier, determines to have the family banished. Webster chose to enact these two events, the Cardinal's return to soldiership and the banishment of the Duchess and her family from Ancona, in the form of a dumb show, a performance employing gestures and body movements without words. Why? By removing speech and focusing instead on mimed action. The dumb show achieves a highly symbolic, pictorial style of theatrical representation, because meaning is conveyed through spectacle rather than words. We are distanced from the action rather than encouraging us to get caught up in the emotions of the characters. The visual tableau asks us instead to step back and evaluate the moral implications of what is happening on stage. It is important that the action takes place at a religious shrine, and that the stage direction calls for solemn music, sung by diverse churchmen. Though when the play was published, Webster disowned the lyrics of the ditty they sing. We watch as the Cardinal sheds the symbols of his religious vocation, cross, hats, robes, and ring, and takes on the trappings of a soldier, sword, helmet, shield, and spurs. This gives vivid usual confirmation to the superficiality of his religious vocation, and the ecclesiastical corruption he has consistently represented. The mimed action of the Duchess's banishment gives a central place to another symbol, her wedding ring, which her brother removes from her finger with violence. As the family is ejected from a place of sanctuary, the visual tableau stresses its extreme vulnerability, as well as the brother's successful assault on the Duchess's marriage. The dumb show is framed by the dialogue of two pilgrims, who begin by anticipating the noble ceremony, and end in a state of some distress, exchanging anxious questions and judgments about the ceremonies they have just witnessed. While they do not entirely exonerate the Duchess, who would have thought so great a lady would have matched herself onto so mean a person, their strongest disapproval is reserved for the brothers and the powers that be who have acted unjustly in banishing a free prince solely on her brother's instigation. As the critic Kate Utterson points out, the fact that the pilgrims lack individual identity, remain unnamed, and never appear again establishes a physical bond with the audience, which encourages us to believe that their objectivity they observe and depart, as we do. Their anonymity and function are choral, like the choruses of Greek tragedy. They objectify and comment on action, distancing and interpreting. The Pilgrim's commentary invites us to grasp the moral and political significance of the Duchess's banishment rather than her own experience of it. It presents her and her family as the victims of an institutional conspiracy. Many of the dramatic devices Webster employs in The Duchess of Malfi are ones we would tend to describe as realistic. His insistence on the complexity of his characters' personalities, his attempts to involve us in the dramatic action unfolding stage, not least through the creation of suspense. Yet he also uses other dramatic techniques, often inherited from medieval drama, that are less concerned to provide a plausible depiction of human motivation or to draw the audience into the action. Instead, these older techniques, like the dumb show in Act 3, Scene 4, seek to distance us from the action unfolding on stage in order to promote our understanding of the larger meanings being conveyed. This mixture of medieval and more modern theatrical devices is not at all unusual in early modern drama. Marlowe does something similar in his play Dr. Faustus 1604, which has characters like a good, a bad, and bad angel, borrowed from medieval morality plays, and at the same time uses soliloquy to endow its protagonist with what the audience experiences as a complex inner life. In The Duchess of Malfi, the combination of realist and non-realist theatrical devices suggests that Webster wanted his audience to think as well as feel, to identify strongly with the heroine and her family, but also to step back and analyze the moral and political implications of their persecution. He was clearly writing with the theater and performance very much in mind, using the resources of the stage to elicit a quite complex response from a live audience. Act 4. Torture and Death. Act 4, comprised of 2 scenes, enacts the Duchess's torture and death, the punishment meted out to her for her forbidden love and marriage. The scenes are arguably among the most memorable in early modern tragedy, yet they contain theatrical devices that can seem alien to a modern-day reader or spectator. Imprisoned in her palace, the Duchess is exposed to a dead man's hand, complete with wedding ring, a wax tableau of her husband and children presented to her as their dead bodies, and finally, a dance of madmen. Why did Webster choose to stage the Duchess's suffering and death in this way, using these, to us, rather puzzling dramatic devices? There are many possible answers to that question, and literary critics are not in agreement about the meaning or the effectiveness of Webster's stagecraft in these scenes. But it might help at this point to consider the playtext in relation to its contemporary contexts, specifically in relation to early modern revenge tragedy in general. In the first major revenge tragedy of the period, Thomas Kyde's The Spanish Tragedy, the climatic revenge takes the form of an on-stage play presented by the hero, Arianima, and starring his enemies, all of whom are murdered as they perform his play within a play. Afterwards, Hieronimo explains to the shocked onstage audience the meaning of his violent actions. Something rather similar takes place in Act 4 of The Duchess. Just as Kyde has his revenge hero present a play that is really the culmination of his quest for vengeance, so Webster has his revenger villain stage a play for his victim complete with props, the dead man's hand, the wax effigies of Antonio and the children, and an on-stage entertainment by madmen, which the critic Inge Stinke Ekblad identifies as a kind of masque, an elaborate courtly extravaganza, with music and dance, and allegorical tablets, much favored by the court of James I. Just as Kyde's Hieronimo interprets his play for the onstage audience, so Bezzola, after the revelation of the wax figures, explains to the Duchess the meaning of what she has just witnessed. And I quote, "He, Ferdinand, doth present you this sad spectacle, that now you know directly they are dead. Hereafter you may wisely cease to grieve, for that which cannot be recovered." In early modern revenge tragedies, then, revenge often takes the form of a theatrical spectacle, a play within a play. The critic Catherine Eisenman speculates that the intimate relation between revenge and theater in Renaissance revenge tragedies stems in part from the highly theatrical nature of judicial punishment in the period. Legally prescribed punishments were themselves popular spectacles throughout Renaissance Europe. Beheadings, hangings, whippings, and pilloryings occurred on raised platforms before large crowds. Many such penalties had symbolic dimensions. Adulterers were paraded in bedsheets, traitors disemboweled, to signify the exposure of their secret malice. The revenger's methods, in other words, do not deviate as markedly as a modern audience might assume from the normal routineness of Renaissance justice. Ferdinand, though, is putting on a play for his sister that he pretends is reality, not theater. Readers know this, as the state's direction informs them that the figures of Antonio and the children are not corpses, but effigies. But a theater audience, at least those who don't know the play, spends most of Act 4, Scene 1 sharing the Duchess's belief that Antonio and the children have been murdered. They thereby participate in the heroine's anguish and grief as she lamentates the loss of her family and longs for death. There is not between heaven and earth one wish I stay for after this. Then, towards the end of the scene, spectators become privy to information denied the Duchess, that the figures are made of wax, literal theatrical props, in a play written and directed by Ferdinand with the intention of driving his sister to despair. Why does Webster stage Act 4, Scene 1 in this way? This is a good example of the way in which he seeks to involve us in the action and then to distance us from it, as the pathos of the scene is succeeded by a renewed awareness of Ferdinand's duplicity. You will recall that Ferdinand and the Cardinal have from the start been identified as accomplished actors who use their gift for dissembling to manipulate and dominate other people. In Act 4, Scene 1, we are reminded of this as Ferdinand is revealed as a kind of playwright who wants his sister to follow the script he has written for her. Once again, Webster shows us that his aristocratic villain uses theater as an instrument of control. The play devotes an entire act to the torture and murder of its protagonist, and, as a result, the Duchess's death takes on an enormous significance. On one level, death is a straightforward evil in the world of the play, part of the sickness and poison which the Cardinal and Ferdinand have been made to represent, from Antonio's line on the destructive impact of corrupt courts. Death and diseases through the whole land spread. Through Ferdinand's deranged revenge fantasies to the court-fit dead bodies produced in Act 4, Scene 1. Yet Ferdinand's aim is not merely to murder his sister, but to bring her to despair, to break her spirit. Ultimately, his plan fails miserably, but it focuses our attention on the inner resources that enable the Duchess to endure her torments and meet her death with so much courage and dignity. To some extent, her fortitude stems from her religious faith. She first expresses Christian attitudes to death and suffering at the end of Act 3. Facing imminent separation from Antonia and their eldest son, she says to him, "In the eternal church, sir, I do hope we shall not part thus." Antonio counsels patient forbearance, and the Duchess replies, and I quote, "Must I, like to a slave-born Russian, account it praise to suffer tyranny? And yet, O heaven, thy heavy hand is in't. I have seen my little boy oft scourge his top, and compare myself to't. Note made me err. Go right but heaven's scourged stick." There is a tension in the lines between her class pride, which bristles at the subject to tyranny, and a Christian belief in divine providence, which sees God's hand at work in all human suffering. The Duchess makes her own simile here, comparing her relationship to God to that between her little boy and his top, a startling image which reminds us of her maternal role, and is not wholly flattering to the heavy-handed ditty she imagines to be scourging her. When she courted and married Antonio, she thought her mutual consent more important than the validation of the church. Here in Act 3, Scene 5, she expresses her faith not with the schooled responses of the regular and obedient churchgoer, but in a deeply personal, almost idiosyncratic fashion. The Duchess hopes but is not sure that she will be reunited with Antonio after death, and later, in Act 4, Scene 2, she asks Cariola, "Dost thou think we shall know one another in the other world?" Cariola replies, "Yes," out of question, But the Duchess sounds more skeptical. Oh, that it were possible we might, but hold some 2 days, conference with the dead. When Bazola enters disguised as an old man, she is far from fully receptive to the Christian contempt for the body which he voices. And I quote, "Thou art a box of worm seed, at best but a salvatory of green mummy. What's this flesh? A little crude milk, fantastical puff paste. Our bodies are weaker than those paper prisons boys use to keep flies in. More contemptible, since ours is to preserve earthworms." This kind of language, designed to instill disgust with what is mortal and corruptible, and to focus the eyes of the dying on the eternal life to come, elicits from the Duchess what is probably the most famous line of the play, "I am Duchess of Malfi still," which is an affirmation of identity clearly resistant to Bazola's assault on human pride. Yet, when her executioners enter the stage carrying a coffin cords and a bell, and Bazola asks her, "Doth not death fright you?" she musters a confidence about the afterlife that earlier eluded her. Who would be afraid on't, knowing to meet such excellent company in the other world? Her final speech, as the executioners prepare to strangle her, offers another strikingly personal take on Christian doctrine. In place of the traditional concept of the soul's flight up to heaven, she imagines her murderers pulling heaven down upon her. And when finally she kneels, it is in a very last-minute acknowledgment that heaven gates are not so highly arched as princes' palaces. But the play makes it clear that religion is not the only source of the Duchess's strength of character. Her outburst of annoyance at the whispering jailers, from whom she clearly longs to escape, tells us that, to a considerable extent, the Duchess simply welcomes death as a release from intolerable suffering. The Duchess's courage, then, is not defined solely or even chiefly in terms of her pity. Indeed, Cariola, who is presented much more clearly as a devout Christian, is shown to confront death with a very human fearfulness that is obviously intended to enhance her admiration for the Duchess. Webster goes to great lengths to convey the full horror of this heroine's death. The executioners are present on stage for a full 70 lines before the murder takes place. We are also made to listen to a discussion of the chosen method for execution, strangling, and then to watch it as it takes place on stage. This can be devastating for an audience, but it serves to communicate the core meaning of death in this play. That how you meet this terrifying end is the ultimate test of your character. This is hardly a novel idea. It is fundamental to several philosophical systems and lies at the heart of the aristocratic concept of honor, which makes the capacity to face the terror of death without flinching the measure of individual heroism. What is novel is that Webster applies what had traditionally been masculine, often martial, concepts of heroism to his heroine, creating in the process a character who has been called the first fully tragic woman in Renaissance drama. Activity 3. Webster devotes a substantial part of this scene to the reactions of Bazola and Ferdinand to the Duchess's death. Why do you think he does this? Have another look at the final section of Act 4, Scene 2, line 237 onwards, and then try to identify at least 3 dramatic functions of this episode. Discussion. This is what I came up with. 1. This section of the scene is important in that it indicates the enormous impact the Duchess's death will have on the rest of the play. 2. It marks the first stage of Bazola's repentance. 3. It also marks the first clear signs of Ferdinand's impending madness. All 3 of these functions look forward to Act 5. Webster, then, is preparing the ground for the last act at the close of Act 4. Bazola's repentance at the end of this scene is obviously a crucial element in the action to come. Yet what strikes me most about its portrayal at this point in the play is that it is far from straightforward. It has all the ambiguity that characterizes Bazola throughout. He seems genuinely moved by the Duchess's death, and at the very end of the scene, when she stirs briefly back to life, rather like Desdemona and Othello, he comforts her with the truth that Antonio is alive, and lie, that he has been reconciled to her brothers. He also fulfills her last wish that her body should be bestowed upon her women. Yet his assertion that he would not change his peace of conscience for all the wealth of Europe comes only after Ferdinand resolutely refuses to reward him for murdering his sister. As ever with Basola, moral impulses are hopelessly entangled with his dependence on the ruling elite that habitually employs him to do its dirty work, only then to deny him the promised payment. Ferdinand's refusal to recompense Basola stems from a comparably powerful sense of the horror of the dead, coupled with a denial of any responsibility for it. The ruler who blames the servant for committing the murder he suborned presents a grotesque distortion of the courtly ideal elaborated at the start of the play. Ferdinand's extreme reaction to the Duchess's death also testifies to his mounting mental instability. His obsession with his sister's sexuality emerges once again in Act 4, when Basola asks him to give the Duchess a penitential garment to put on, next to her delicate skin. And the mere mention of his sister's flesh is enough to send Ferdinand reeling, and I quote, "Damn her, that body of hers, while that my blood ran pure in't, was more worth than that which thou wouldst comfort called a soul." The lines suggest how deeply entangled are Ferdinand's fixations on aristocratic purity of blood in his sister's body, perhaps implying that his incestuous desire stems from a class pride so extreme that only his own sister appears an appropriate sexual partner. Intriguingly, he tells us in Act 4, Scene 2 that the two of them were twins, which reinforces the closeness of the family tie. At any rate, by this stage of the play, we are unlikely to feel convinced by Ferdinand's claim that he opposed the Duchess's remarriage because he was hoping to gain an infinite mass of treasure by her death, had she remained a widow. He reveals to Basola that he and the Duchess were twins immediately after seeing his sister's dead body for the first time. His one-line response to the sight, "Cover her face. Mine eyes dazzle, she died young," has often been admired for the glimpse it seems to give us of a state of acute psychological distress. The punctuation varies from edition to edition. The original quarto prefers semicolons to full stops. Yet, regardless of the punctuation used, what is unusual and striking about the line is that it seems so full, with its 3 sentences or clauses of 3 words, each packed into 11 syllables. It is in fact hard for actors to deliver in the theater without placing significant pauses between each clause or sentence. But this crowded, highly condensed line seems to point to a world of pain and loss, as Ferdinand sees his dead sister and grasps the enormity of what he has done. By the close of the scene, he is falling apart, deteriorating into the lunacy that will characterize him in Act 5. "I'll go hunt the badger by owl light. 'Tis a deed of darkness." Act 5. The play without the Duchess. Act 5 has more than any other aspect of the play raised the hackles of critics. Webster has often been rebuked, especially by feminist critics, for killing off his heroine at the end of Act 4 rather than at the end of the play, as is normally the fate of tragic heroes. Many critics have been frankly baffled by the tone of Act 5, which seems to be aiming not for the high seriousness one expects of a tragedy, but for a kind of black comedy. What do you think Webster was trying to achieve in Act 5? Why write a tragedy with a tragic heroine who is absent from the entire last act? We can begin trying to answer those questions by looking at one of the most famous scenes in the play, Act 5, Scene 3, known as the Echo Scene. Act 5, Scene 3, the Echo Scene. Activity 4. Reread the scene now. What in your view is the point of this scene? What meanings does it convey to the reader/spectator? Discussion. I would say that one of the main points of this scene is to convey to readers and spectators the Duchess's continued presence in the world of the play. The previous scene draws to a close with Basola's words, "Still methinks the Duchess haunts me," and the echo scene is, in a very real sense, another haunting. The audience, aware that the Duchess is dead, quickly grasps the supernatural significance of the voice which sounds to Antonio so much like the voice of his wife. and which tries to warn him of impending danger. Oh, fly your fate. It's not surprising that in many productions of the play, the Duchess appears on stage during the scene. This is another scene worth considering in relation to the conventions of revenge tragedy. If you are familiar with Hamlet, you will know that ghosts often haunt revenge tragedies, bringing messages to the living from beyond the grave. Webster, though, makes his ghost an echo in a ruined abbey. For Antonio, unaware of what has happened to his wife, the echo is just an echo, and much of the scene's sadness derives from the fact that the Duchess's warning does not get through, that she is unable to protect her husband. Yet the scene is perhaps ultimately not as bleak as this suggests. It is set in a ruined abbey, which on one level presents change, decay, and death as the condition of the world. Antonio comments that the men buried there must have imagined the abbey would shelter them from all time, when in fact all things have their end. Yet in Antonio's view, something potent remains of the ancient ruins. It survived history. In much of the same way, the Duchess, though also ruined, survives in the form of a clear light that ravels momentarily to Antonio a face folded in sorrow. The scene ends with 3 lines that, unbeknown to Antonio, could serve as the Duchess's epitaph and sum up her heroism, and I quote, "Though in our miseries fortune hath a part, yet in our noble sufferings she hath none. Contempt of pain, that we may call our own." The Aragonian Burthern. Ferdinand's lycanthropy, his belief that he has been transformed into a wolf whose skin is hairy on the inside rather than the outside, clearly manifests a mental collapse attendant on the murder of the Duchess. He is driven mad by guilt and a self-revulsion that convicts him of being no better than the most vicious of animals. His lycanthropy is at once a judgment on his appalling cruelty, and a reminder of the flickering moral awareness that has always been part of his character. He is convinced not only that he is turned into a wolf, but that he is damned. The Cardinal, too, is shown to be consumed with guilt. Not that he has stopped plotting and murdering, he dispatches Bazzola to assassinate Antonio, and he murders Julia, the mistress of whom he has grown wary, by having her kiss a poisoned Bible. In this episode, Webster is working well within the conventions of revenge tragedy, a genre which reveals in inventing and staging ever more ingenious ways of killing people, particularly with poison, poisoned skulls, poisoned shirts, poisoned showers of gold, along with the Cardinal's poisoned Bible, are all instruments of murder in Renaissance revenge tragedies. Yet despite all the Cardinal's continued crimes, the play makes it clear that he has a bad conscience. In Act 5, Webster gives him 2 brief soliloquies. The first, in Scene 4, shows him wanting to pray but lacking any real confidence in its efficacy. This is not an indication of his lack of faith, as his second soliloquy, which opens Scene 5, demonstrates. The Cardinal enters carrying a book, the argument of which is that some people destined for the fires of hell will suffer more than others, like Ferdinand. Then the Cardinal fully expects to go to hell. Although he is not in the grip of a full-blown mental illness, his soliloquy makes clear the extent of his mental disturbance. When he looks in the fish ponds in his garden, he hallucinates. And I quote, "Methinks I see a thing armed with a rack. That seems to strike at me." The Cardinal is haunted by visions of the retribution awaiting him for his crimes. A savage farce. We have seen that Bazzola too is haunted by his part in the Duchess's death, though in his case this leads to a desire to repent, to ally himself unambiguously with the forces of good by protecting Antonio from the Cardinal's homicidal intentions. But he ends up inadvertently doing the Cardinal's bidding. He kills Antonio by mistake. This looks like a comment on Bazzola's quest for redemption, an enactment of the sad fact that he is just too tainted by his past actions to renounce his role as hired assassin. However, we also need to consider this accidental killing within the context of the 5th act as a whole. After the seriousness of Act 4 and the Duchess's torture and death, we find ourselves suddenly in a very different dramatic world, which we might be inclined to call a savage farce, adapting the poet. There is certainly grim humor in the staging of Ferdinand's lunacy, particularly in his attempt to throttle his own shadow in Scene 2, and his altercations with the Doctor who fails miserably to control him. The wild comedy escalates in Scene 5, as Bezzola, bent on vengeance, closes in on the Cardinal, whose screams for help are ignored by the courtiers, who believe they come from the mad Ferdinand. Ferdinand then enters, mad as a hatter, thinking he is on a noisy battlefield and his brother is an enemy soldier. He ends up stabbing his brother and Bezzola in an undignified scuffle. Having no idea where he is or what he is doing, Bezzola then stabs and kills Ferdinand. What are we to make of all this? By the end of the play, the stage is littered with corpses. This is nothing unusual in a Renaissance tragedy, but the dark comedy that runs through the entire last act seems designed to deprive these deaths of the dignity accorded to the Duchess in her final moments. The stage action evokes chaos and disorder, a group of men running headlong to their destruction. To Bezzola, this bespeaks grim truths about the nature of earthly existence, as he observes bitterly after accidentally giving Antonio his death wound. We are merely the stars' tennis balls, struck and banded, which way pleased them. In other words, human beings have no free will and no real significance. We are simply the playings of probably malevolent cosmic forces. Ferdinand says something similar in his dying moments, and I quote, "My sister! Oh, my sister! There's the cause on't, whether we fail by ambition, blood, or lust. Like diamonds we are cut with our own dust." The inverted commas are on the couplet single that Ferdinand's dying words had a proverbial status. He is applying to himself an entirely appropriate saying about human beings' capacity for self-destruction. We are prisoners of our own temperaments, driven by forces, passions, and instincts over which we have minimum control. Ferdinand's focus is the human personality, Bezzola's the cosmos, but the two characters agree that human beings exert precious little control over what they do. Even Antonio dies convinced of the vanity of his own ambitions. And I quote, "In all our quest of greatness, like wanton boys whose pastime is their care, we follow after bubbles blown in the air." The search for self-advancement is ultimately futile in Antonio's eyes. His dying wish is that his eldest son should fly the courts of princess and thereby avoid the trap into which his father fell. The cardinal dies thinking not of the hellfire that preoccupied him earlier, but his own insignificance. "And now, I pray let me, be laid by and never thought of." In the abstinence of the Duchess, the principal male characters stumble and stagger towards death, persuaded of the vanity and meaninglessness of their lives. This would seem to be Webster's point, as the critic Leomarcus explains. And I quote, "The Duchess is not flawless, but she carries with her a capacity for light, joy, and love that enlivens an otherwise festering world. By showing how the play is emptied of light and reduced to madness and chaos when she is gone, Webster makes large claims for the power of virtue in general. Thus, the grim humor of Act 5 can be seen as an integral part of Webster's overall design, the sign of a dramatic world deprived of the positive values the Duchess came to represent. It is clear, moreover, that of the many deaths that have occurred by the end of the play, the Duchess alone appears both heroic in its self-possession and tragic in the sense of loss it engenders. Her brothers die expressing a degree of clarity and self-knowledge conspicuously lacking in their lives, and their deaths are memorable, thanks to the striking lines given them by their creator. But Webster imparts to those deaths a very different meaning from that accorded to the Duchesses, summed up in the Cardinal's dying words and by Delio in the closing speech of the play. And I quote, "These wretched eminent things leave no more fame behind them than should one fall in a frost and leave his print in snow. As soon as the sun shines, it never melts, both form and matter." Delio's analogy between the wretched eminent things lying dead on the stage and a footprint in snow condemns Ferdinand and the Cardinal to obscurity and oblivion. Death for them means erasure from historical record, a dreadful fate for members of the ruling elite who traditionally expected their status and power to leave its mark on the world and to guarantee them an afterlife in the memory of the community. We often expect, or at least want, the endings of plays to offer us some kind of consolation, an expectation that may well be intensified by the Duchess's death at the end of Act 4, and the enormous sense of loss it creates. While Ferdinand and the Cardinal may fear damnation, the play is not interested in speculating on the divine judgments that might await them in the next world. Instead, it keeps its eyes firmly on this world, presenting us with the spectacle of its two principal villains falling apart, cracking under the strain of their own guilt and remorse. The contrast with the sister they tormented and murdered is obvious. The second consolation the play proffers is equally secular and promise that great men who use their power to wicked ends will be forgotten after death. Again, there is a marked contrast with the Duchess, who lives on so vividly in the memories of the characters who survive her. Delio's closing couplet, integrity of life is fame's best friend, which nobly beyond death shall crown the end, envisages only one form of eternal life, the lasting fame and noble reputation that greet integrity of life. This reward the play clearly bestows on its heroine and conspicuously denies its villains. We may also derive some comfort from the fact that Delio appears on stage in the closing moments of the play with the eldest son of Antonio and the Duchess, and proposes that the survivors join all our force to establish this young hopeful gentleman, in's mother's right. Activity 5. How should we respond to the prospect of the eldest child of the Duchess's forbidden marriage inheriting his mother's dukedom? A good way to start answering this question is to go back through the play and remind yourself of all the information provided to us about this child. Does this encourage us to feel optimistic or pessimistic about the future? Is there another claimant to the title? Discussion. The first thing we learned about the child is that his horoscope predicts a short life and a violent death. Hardly a hopeful sign. Later in Act 3, Scene 3, lines 69 to 71, we are told that the Duchess had a son with her first husband, whose claim on the dukedom her brothers are supporting. Ferdinand refers to him in this scene as the Duke of Malfi, and of course we can hardly help but remember Antonio's dying words, "And let my son fly the courts of princes." None of this seems designed to instill much confidence in the child's chances of securing and holding onto the dukedom of Malfi. The likelihood of his succeeding in the cutthroat world of Italian politics seems slim, but we should consider as well what the play's final moments look like in the theater, the visual signs they give an audience. There are 6 dead bodies on the stage and 6 loving characters, Delio, the boy, and 4 courtiers. As Antonio's loyal friend, Delio invites her trust, though in this instance he is unwittingly violating his friend's final request. Yet the courtiers, apart from Pescara, have been Ferdinand's lackeys, which does not necessarily augur well for the birth of a new social order. The child is young and vulnerable. In productions he is often dressed in white, which may signal innocence and purity, but also weakness. Ultimately, it is up to directors to decide whether to stage the play's final moments in a hopeful or pessimistic fashion. What kind of tragedy is the Duchess of Malfi? The critics I mentioned in Chapter 3 who have argued for the Duchess's culpability, her own responsibility for the disastrous consequences of a marriage entered into out of lust and a lamentable feminine willfulness, were partly indulging their own negative views of women and partly working on the assumption that all Renaissance tragic protagonists have a tragic flaw, a serious character failing that propels them towards disaster. This notion of the tragic flaw comes from a misreading of Aristotle, the 4th century BCE Greek philosopher who, in his Poetics, came to general conclusions about the characteristics of tragedy on the basis of the tragic drama that he had watched in Athens. In describing the tragic hero, Aristotle used the word hamartia, which is better translated as error of judgment or mistake than character flaw. But this has not stopped 20th century literary critics from expending a good deal of energy identifying and dissecting the fatal flaws of Renaissance tragic heroes, including Webster's Duchess. Having spent the last two chapters reading and studying the Duchess of Malfi, we should perhaps conclude by asking ourselves whether Webster's conception of tragedy in the play has much of anything to do with Aristotle or with what we conceive Aristotle to have said about tragic plays. Certainly, as Leomarcus observes, the Duchess is not portrayed as blameless. We have seen that there are murmurs of criticism leveled at her by credible characters like Cariola and the Pilgrims, and the play unquestionably leaves room for us to recognize her harshness in defying her brothers. But it would, I think, be hard to argue persuasively that it blames her for the tragic course of events. On the contrary, as Act 5 makes abundantly clear, she is the sole source of light and love in a gloomy, claustrophobic, dramatic world. The tragedy of the Duchess of Malfi is that she is destroyed, her bid for self-determination crushed by a brutal and corrupt aristocratic order. Webster, then, seems to be much less interested in fatal flaws than in flawed social and political systems, and the havoc they wreak in decent people's lives. His tragic world knows us the individual trapped by destructive social and political ideas and practices, yet powerful in so far as she can affirm her integrity and human dignity even in defeat. Conclusion. The Duchess of Malfi has been performed more often in the 20th and 21st centuries than any other non-Shakespearean play of the early modern period. Between 1934 and 1989, there were no fewer than 40 commercial productions. It has been revived with particular frequency since 1945 and at the end of the Second World War. Marcus argues that this peak in popularity attests to the frequent correlation between a public taste for Webster and broader social trauma. That the cumulative cultural rupture of two world wars and the Holocaust resonated that Webster's dramatic emphasis on horror, disjunction, and extreme suffering. I would argue that the play's continued appeal for 20th and 21st century audiences also has much to do with the way in which Webster finds tragic meaning in the struggle against an oppressive patriarchal elite. Unlike Shakespeare, who concentrates so much of his imaginative energies on dramatizing the experiences and suffering of great men, Webster is interested in what feels like to be a woman, even of one of noble birth, in a world dominated by ruling class men, and to be a man of lower rank, entirely dependent on one's social superiors for advancement. His highly politicized understanding of tragedy produced, as we have seen, the first fully tragic heroine in English drama, a role which has attracted some of the finest British actresses of recent years, including Judi Dench, Helen Mirren, Harriet Walter, and Janet McTeer. It might be fitting to close this chapter with the words of the Irish poet Derek Mahone, who in 1998 wrote a poem called Dirge about the infectious power of Webster's play in his heroine. And I quote, "Even so we revel in the infection, flirt, with the corruption of the provincial court, seduced by scheming web and flowery skull, and dazzled by I am Duchess of Malfi still." His wish as a poet, Mahone says, is to do homage in our own violent time, to one who lights time past and time to come.